You made it through another day, and now it's time to rest. I've saved a quiet story for you, just like always. If this brings you peace, a like or a subscribe tells me I'm helping. And what time are you listening to this? Just before bed? Or maybe long after midnight? Now, let your thoughts settle, and we'll begin. The cafe that never changed its menu. I don't remember when I first noticed the cafe. It was just there one day, on the corner between a bookstore I never entered and a florist that never had quite the flowers I needed. It wasn't grand. The sign above the door was simple, June's, in faded paint that may have once been red. I passed it for months without stopping, but I remember the first time I looked through the window and realized something odd. The menu, printed on pale yellow paper behind the glass, hadn't changed. Same 7 items, same font, same prices. Week after week, no specials, no seasonal updates, just the same. I started walking slower past that window. I'd check. The mushroom soup, the butter toast, the almond cake, always in the same order. And then one day, I went in. A small bell chimed as I opened the door, soft and forgettable. The room smelled of baked sugar and black coffee, and something warmer I couldn't place, maybe cinnamon or old books. A woman behind the counter looked up and smiled. "Anywhere you like," she said. Her voice was even practiced. Not disinterested, just calm. Like she'd said it 1,000 times before and would say it 1,000 times again. I sat by the window, facing out. The table was clean but worn smooth, where elbows must have rested over years of quiet. There were 4 other patrons inside. One man reading a newspaper, 2 women speaking in hushed tones, and a boy, maybe 16, stirring tea but not drinking it. No music, just the sound of cups, chairs, and soft breath. The woman came to my table with a pencil and a small notebook. "First time?" she asked. I nodded. "You'll want the almond cake," she said, not as a suggestion, but as knowledge. I didn't argue. She wrote nothing down, but brought it minutes later with black tea and no explanation. The cake was dense but not heavy, sweet but not cloying. It tasted like something I hadn't realized I missed. I didn't speak to anyone else. I left a 5-pound note, and she returned the exact change, silently, with a small nod. When I stepped out into the street again, it felt like I had exited something more than just a cafe, like I had briefly entered a room that existed slightly beside time. I went back the next week. Same bell, same table, same smile. The menu was unchanged. But on the 3rd visit, I noticed something new beneath the counter, barely visible from where I sat. A small red notebook. Each time someone ordered, the woman would make a quick mark inside it. Not prices, not inventory, something else. On my 5th visit, I heard the 2 women beside me whispering, "He wrote another one said. "Left it in the red book." The other nodded. 3rd time this month. I didn't ask what they meant. Not yet, but I knew I'd be back. And I knew now that the unchanged menu wasn't the only thing keeping people here. It took me a few weeks before I asked about the red book. Not because I was hesitant, but because something about it felt like it belonged to a slower kind of knowing. You don't ask questions in places like June's. You wait until the answers lean in close enough to recognize you. The woman behind the counter, I had started calling her June in my head, though I wasn't sure that was her name, always greeted me the same way. A nod, a half smile, a hand motion toward my usual table. The almond cake was never offered again. It simply arrived with tea. No lemon, no milk, just how I'd had it the first time. The routine settled into me like breath. By the seventh visit, I knew the exact creak the chair would make as I sat. I knew which sugar spoon would be slightly bent. I knew that around 10 minutes past the hour, she'd glance toward the front window, not looking at anything, just checking. And I knew that when no one was watching, she'd open the drawer below the counter and make a small, deliberate mark in the red notebook. One day, as the cafe began to empty after the lunch lull, I stayed a little longer than usual, just watching, breathing, letting the quiet do its work. That's when an older man entered mid-60s maybe, with a deep navy coat and a single yellow button on the sleeve. He walked straight to the counter and waited. June didn't ask what he wanted. She simply nodded and handed him the red notebook. He took it carefully, with both hands, like it was something sacred, sat down 2 tables from me, flipped to a page somewhere in the middle, and began to write. I didn't stare, but I watched. The way you watch someone tie a shoelace. Familiar, simple, but somehow deeply personal. He wrote for 5 minutes, maybe more, then closed the book, returned it silently, and left. No food, no drink, just the words. The next day, when I returned, I caught June's eye for a second longer than usual. "What's the book for?" I asked finally. She didn't seem surprised. She wiped her hands on a towel and said, "It's for the things we can't say aloud," that was all. No further explanation, no invitation. But from that moment on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started noticing others, the woman with the dark green scarf who always left an extra coin on the windowsill, the quiet young man who read poetry but never turned the page, the child who drew pictures on napkins and folded them like letters before handing them to June. I began to understand. The cafe wasn't unchanged. It was steady. A place where people could come and bring the parts of themselves that didn't fit anywhere else. And the red book wasn't a log or a diary. It was a shelter, a place where things could be left behind and still somehow be heard. I didn't ask to write in it, not yet. But every time I passed the counter and saw the corner of its cover peeking out from the drawer, I felt something stir. A sentence, a moment, something waiting for a place to land. It happened on a Tuesday. I hadn't meant to write anything. I had told myself that many times, that I was only there for the almond cake, for the stillness, for the way the cafe didn't ask anything of me except presence. But that morning felt different. The light outside had a kind of softness that made everything feel more temporary, and the corner table where I always sat felt more like a mirror than a seat. I watched June for a while. Her hands moved with that same careful rhythm. She arranged plates like they mattered, like someone would remember the way the toast sat just slightly angled on the edge. She smiled a little more that day. Or maybe I was just paying better attention. At 10 minutes past 11, the cafe grew still, a brief lull. The 2 women with the crossword puzzle stood to leave. The boy who always ordered warm milk without speaking was still tracing his finger around the edge of the mug. I stood slowly and walked to the counter. She looked at me and, without a word, opened the drawer and placed the red book on the surface. Her fingers lingered on it for a second, then let go. I took it in my hands, heavier than I expected. It felt warm, as if the words inside had given off their own quiet heat over time. I carried it back to my table. The spine creaked just slightly as I opened it. Pages filled with different hands. Slanted cursive, blocky print. A few drawings. Some full paragraphs. Some just a sentence. Some not words at all. Symbols, circles, marks that felt private, but also offered, willingly. I didn't search for meaning. I didn't read long. I stopped when I reached a blank page. That was mine. My hands hesitated, the way they do before touching something delicate. I took the pencil June had left beside my tea and wrote slowly, honestly, without planning. I don't know what I came here to remember, but this place makes me feel like I'm already doing it. That was it. I didn't sign my name. I closed the book gently and returned it to the counter. June said nothing, but her eyes softened when I handed it back. I sat down again and finished my tea. The taste was sharper than usual, brighter. That afternoon I stayed longer than I had in weeks, just listening. Not just to the room, but to the space inside myself that had become a little less cluttered, a little more open. The red book had taken the weight of something unnamed, and in return left silence behind. But not the kind of silence that isolates, the kind that waits with you. I hadn't planned to read more entries. The red book had felt personal, sacred even, and I thought that writing in it once would be enough. But on a rainy morning the following week, the cafe was quieter than usual. No boy with warm milk, no crossword puzzle ladies, just the steady hum of rain against the windows and the distant clink of plates being stacked in the back. I had brought nothing with me that day. No book, no phone, no intention, just myself, and the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something. June brought my tea and cake without speaking. As always, I sipped slowly, listening to the muted sounds of water outside, and eventually, without quite deciding to, I stood and approached the counter. I didn't ask. I simply looked. She handed me the red book without a word. This time, I didn't go to the back of it. I opened somewhere in the middle, letting the pages fall where they wanted. And there, between two short entries, was something longer. A passage written in steady, upright handwriting. Not poetic, not dramatic, just real. I told someone I was fine today. I wasn't. I told them I had moved on. I haven't. I told them I don't think about her anymore. I do. I think about the sound she made when she read something she loved. I think about the way she used to fold her sleeves. I think about how no one else in the world will ever touch my name the way she did. But I said I was fine. Because it was easier. Because it had to be. There was no signature, no date, nothing but those words sitting there like a confession folded into the middle of a breath. I closed the book slowly. I didn't want to know who had written it. Somehow, it didn't feel like it mattered. What mattered was the way it made the room feel different after I read it. Heavier, still, honest. I carried that feeling with me for days. It changed the way I looked at the people in the cafe. The man who always ordered the same sandwich and never looked up from his plate. The woman who sat by the window but always faced the door. June, who moved like memory and weather were the same thing. I wondered what each of them had written, or hadn't. And then I wondered what it meant to carry pain so gently that only paper could feel it. That's what the book had become to me. Not just a collection of entries, but a place where the world could leave its softer bruises and let them rest, unjudged. That night, I dreamed of a version of myself sitting across from someone I had never met but knew completely. We said nothing, but we shared a silence that felt like home. And when I woke up, I didn't write anything down. I just remembered quietly, without folding it away. It was the way she placed the cake. That's how I noticed it. Not the gesture itself, she still set it down quietly on the right side of the tea. Napkin neatly tucked, but the pause that followed. She lingered for just a second longer, looked at me, then the book resting beside my saucer, then back to me, not with a question, just presence. I nodded, almost involuntarily, and she moved on. That was the first time I realized June, if that was truly her name, had read the entries, or at least knew them, not just as ink, but as people. That changed something for me. The cafe no longer felt like neutral ground. It was curated, held, observed. A place shaped gently by hands that knew when not to interfere. I stayed longer that day. After most of the tables had emptied, and the light through the windows had gone from white to gold, June had started wiping down the front display case when I stood and walked to the counter. "You read them?" I asked quietly, gesturing toward the drawer. She didn't answer right away, just placed the cloth on the counter, looked at me, and said, "Not all. Only the ones that ask to be seen." I let that sentence settle. "How do you know which ones those are?" She gave a soft smile. They stopped hiding after a while. Then she turned back toward the kitchen, and I returned to my table, slower this time. I didn't touch the red book that day, but something in me had already started writing. Later, as I was leaving, June called out softly behind me, the first time she had spoken more than a sentence since I'd started coming. "You don't have to leave something every time," she said, "but you can always take something with you." I turned back, met her eyes for just a moment, and nodded. That evening, I walked slower than usual. The city was beginning to light itself. Storefronts glowing, people passing, wind pushing dry leaves into brief spirals, but I wasn't distracted. I kept thinking about what she'd said, that you could take something with you. Not a sentence, not a page, but a feeling, a presence. And I began to wonder if the cafe itself was not just a place to return to, but a kind of person in its own way. The kind that listens so deeply, it doesn't need to speak. That night, before sleep, I whispered a thank you into the quiet. Not to June, not to anyone in particular, just to the space that had made room for something in me I hadn't realized needed to rest. I arrived later than usual that Thursday, a small shift in schedule. Nothing dramatic. The streets had been busier, and I'd lingered too long outside the used bookstore down the block. When I opened the cafe door, The bell chimed, soft and familiar, but the room felt different, subtle but unmistakable. The table where I always sat was taken a man I didn't recognize, eating alone, reading a menu he didn't seem to really look at. I stood for a moment near the door, uncertain. For the first time, I felt like a visitor, out of step with something I hadn't known I depended on. June wasn't behind the counter. Instead, a younger woman with tired eyes and a slightly crooked apron was restocking mugs. She glanced at me, polite but brief. "Just a minute," she said, voice clipped. I nodded, slowly. The rhythm was broken. I sat at a different table farther from the window, closer to the radiator that clicked faintly with heat. The tea came later than usual. No cake, no red book, just a cup and a small receipt I hadn't asked for. The woman didn't smile. She didn't know. How could she? But I felt its absence like an echo with no original sound. I waited, maybe 20 minutes, long enough to convince myself I was fine, long enough to notice how quiet the room had become, not calm, quiet, but vacant. I sipped the tea. It was the same, I think, but it didn't taste the same. At some point, I asked gently, "Is June in today?" The woman looked up from where she was folding napkins. "She stepped out, back tomorrow, probably." Probably, that word stayed with me. When I left the cafe, the sky had darkened. I hadn't written anything. I hadn't stayed long, and as I walked back toward the quieter end of town, I felt something inside me shift, not a break, but a question. I realized I had never thought about June being gone, not once. I had accepted the rhythm of her presence as fixed, like a clock that ticks softly behind your life until it doesn't. That night, I didn't sleep well. Not because something was wrong, but because something was missing. Something small, something quiet, but something I had come to depend on without realizing it. And I understood then, lying awake in the still room, that this place, that she had become a kind of map for me. And without that compass, even for a day, I felt just a little more lost than I had expected. She was back on Monday. The bell above the door gave its usual muted ring, and when I stepped inside, there she was, behind the counter, folding a towel slowly, as if the gesture itself helped her stay anchored. For a moment, everything looked the same. The chairs, the soft plates of almond cake already prepped beneath glass, the faint smell of something toasted. But I saw it in her face. Before she even turned fully toward me, something had shifted, not broken, just quiet, in a new way. I gave a small nod. She returned it, gently. "Your table's free," she said. I sat in the usual spot by the window, fingers trailing lightly over the wood, as if to confirm it hadn't moved in my absence. My tea arrived with the same weight, the cake with the same texture. But she didn't linger this time. She didn't meet my eyes. And when I glanced toward the counter drawer, the red book wasn't there. I didn't ask. I wanted to, not to pry, but to reassure, to say, "I noticed," but something about the air told me to wait. So I did. I sat longer than usual, watching the street. The world outside moved like always. People walking with half unwrapped scarves, shopkeepers adjusting window displays no one looked at. But the cafe had grown a new kind of stillness, one that wasn't inviting, one that felt more like someone holding their breath. As I stood to leave, June finally looked up. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. "Did you miss it?" she asked quietly. I paused, not sure whether she meant the cafe, the book, or her. "Yes," I said. She nodded slowly, like the answer was both expected and somehow needed. "Sometimes I go too quiet," she said, "and I forget how to make space again." I didn't respond. I just stepped closer to the counter, took out a small folded piece of paper from my coat pocket, and placed it gently in front of her. "Not everything needs to be written down," I said. "But if it does, I thought you might want to keep this." She looked at the paper but didn't open it, just rested her hand over it and gave the faintest nod I'd seen yet, the kind you give when you're not ready to speak, but grateful someone waited. I left without needing her to say more. That night, I walked slower than usual, hands deep in my coat pockets, thinking about how fragile even the most comforting places can feel when absence touches them, and how belonging doesn't mean perfection, it means returning anyway. Even when the rhythm falters, even when the tea is a little too hot, or the silence too long, you return, not because it's the same, but because it still holds something you're not ready to lose. I didn't return the next Tuesday. Not because I didn't want to, but because I had begun to realize something I hadn't understood before. Belonging isn't always about presence. Sometimes it's about understanding the space you've left behind. Sometimes the act of waiting is enough. June's Cafe stayed there, in its quiet place between the street and the world. People came and went, cups were refilled, smiles exchanged, and yet something had changed in me. I didn't need the red book anymore, not because I had forgotten about it, but because the words that had filled it had somehow started to echo in my own thoughts, in my own silence. I went back the week after, but not to sit, just to stand outside and watch, to see if the cafe would feel the same. It did. I stood there for a long time. The bell chimed when the door opened. The woman behind the counter gave a soft, steady smile. She looked different now, softer, and in her eyes there was a quiet understanding, as if the space between us had been bridged not by words, but by something deeper. I didn't need to sit anymore. I didn't need to write anything. I didn't need to be anyone other than who I was right there, standing in the doorway, watching the cafe in its familiar rhythm. I left, slowly, with a feeling that I had never really been gone, that the quiet space I had been given, the one that June and I had shared without even speaking, was a part of me now, not because it was mine, but because it had always been open. And as I walked away, I knew that the next time I came back, I wouldn't need to explain. Not to her, not to anyone. I had simply learned how to be present in a place that didn't need me to make it whole. It already was.